These are not signs of a healthy economy.
Tony, firstly today, how is the US economy doing?
Terrible. Average growth during the current alleged recovery has been 2.2%. This is anemic. The Wall Street Journal has compared the strength of economic recoveries, and this is just the worst ever, or at least since World War II. The most disturbing bit of data in the chart is the decline in business non-residential fixed investment, which fell by 2.2% in the second quarter. If you remember your basic macroeconomics, you will remember the investment multiplier. A decline in business fixed investment implies more downward pressure on real GDP growth in the future.
So what's the explanation? Let's start with the Affordable Care Act.
Professor Casey Mulligan has some good arguments that the ongoing malaise is caused by implicit tax increases. In September 2014, he published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. Professor Mulligan argues that although the ACA helps specific populations by giving them a bigger slice of the economic pie, the law diminishes the pie itself. It reduces the amount that Americans work, and it makes their work less productive. This slows growth in both personal income and gross domestic product. Second, Professor Mulligan points to the incentive effects of subsidies given to low-income and/or part-time workers. Those incentives almost certainly induce some workers to either reduce their hours of work or quit work entirely. The Affordable Care Act rules define full-time work as 30 hours per week or more. Some workers who are barely over the limit may actually find it advantageous to work a few hours less per week in return for ACA subsidies. And of course, many employers have cut back worker hours because part-time workers can be excluded from employer-based health care plans. According to Professor Mulligan's estimates, the ACA is the third largest tax increase in U.S. history. Professor Mulligan then made a brave forecast. I estimate that the ACA's long-term impact will include about 3% less weekly employment, 3% fewer aggregate work hours, 2% less GDP, and 2% less labor income. These effects will be visible and obvious by 2017, if not before. The employment and hours estimates are based on the combined amount of the law's new taxes and disincentives and on historical research on the aggregate effects of each dollar of taxation. The GDP and income estimates reflect lower amounts of labor as well as the law's effects on the productivity of each hour of labor. If that sounds familiar, it should. Today's economy is a good reflection of this forecast. In other words, Professor Mulligan got it right.
Okay, and what about distress in the labor market?
The Bureau of Labor Statistics actually publishes a number of labor market statistics in addition to the unemployment rate. Here are four measures of the unemployment rate, quarterly data through the first quarter of 2016. The U6 measure of unemployment has remained stubbornly above 10% since 2008. The gap between U4 and U0 has shrunk considerably, but there are other factors working in the labor market. The labor force participation rate is the lowest in 40 years. The labor force participation rate is the labor force divided by civilian adult population. The labor force is defined as the sum of the number of people employed and the number officially unemployed. In order to be counted as unemployed, an individual must be actively looking for a job. When someone stops looking for a job, they are no longer part of the labor force. As more people drop out of the labor force, the unemployment rate falls. Some people believe the decline in the participation rate is caused by retiring baby boomers. The data shows that's not true. Most of the decline has been in the 18 to 35 age group. Participation rates have actually increased among those aged 55 to 75. The best research available shows that no more than half the decline in the labor force participation rate is caused by baby boomers leaving the labor force, that is, retiring. These are not signs of a healthy economy.
Okay, and what about regulations?
Measuring the cost of regulations is very difficult. How can you compare the cost of anti-coal regulations from the Environmental Protection Agency with a regulation that says 30 hours of work per week is full-time employment. Economists that have attempted this have my undying admiration. Let me point to one study. Bentley Coffey, Pat McLaughlin, and Pietro Pareto of the Mercatus Center at George Mason University published The Cumulative Cost of Regulations, April 2016. This is a working paper available from mercatus.org. The three authors estimated the effects of federal regulation on GDP using a panel of 22 industries over a 35-year span. Without going into technical details, they find that economic growth since 1980 has been reduced by 0.8% per year. That may not sound like much, but in the world of growth economics, it is a huge difference. The current long-term growth rate seems to be around 2.2%. Economists find that barely acceptable. But if you add 0.8 percentage point, that would make the growth rate 3%. Economists would be jumping up and down with glee if that were the rate. The authors go on to estimate the cost to the U.S. economy at $4 trillion in 2012 alone, about $13,000 per capita. That's $39,000 per year for a family of three. The authors have an interesting database that measures the quantity and impactfulness of regulations. Here are two simple measures of regulations. Since 1977, both have increased by about 50%. President Obama is the top regulator since former President Carter's term in office. One way to look at the data is total regulations issued by each president. Presidents George H.W. Bush and former President Carter are handicapped in that each only served a single term, and the data is only available through 2014, giving President Obama 2 more years to cap his regulatory legacy. Another way to look at the data is the number of new regulations during each presidential term. Once again, President Obama edges out Carter for first place. And of course, Obama's second term is not yet complete. The author's conclusions: from 1997 to 2010, the least regulated industries experienced 63% growth in output per person, 64% growth in output per hour, and a 4% decline in unit labor costs. During the same period, the most regulated industries experienced 33% growth in output per person, 34% growth in output per hour, and a 20% increase in unit labor costs.
Okay, is there anything else?
A ton of new regulations and restrictions combined with the third largest tax increase in U.S. history means slow growth. And frankly, I don't see much hope for the next few years. Neither of the current presidential candidates has said much about this issue. And as long as most economists refuse to recognize the problem, there is little hope of a solution.
Okay, Tony, well, thank you so much for coming and chatting with us today and sharing your in-depth insight.
It's been my pleasure.
That's all from myself and Tony today, but if you did like this interview, be sure to give it a like and comment on our website, dukascopy.tv.